Sister-in-law shoved me in my own driveway and told me to stay out of her family's business. The next morning, I dropped a manila envelope on her kitchen counter. She saw the thickness of it and smiled. "Finally came to your senses, old man," she said. She was still smiling when she opened it. She stopped smiling fast. "I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years as a high school history teacher in Knoxville, Tennessee, and I can tell you that I have watched a lot of people underestimate quiet men. It never ends well for them. My wife, Carol, passed from ovarian cancer in the spring of 2021. I want you to understand what that means before anything else in this story. 29 years of marriage. She used to fold the newspaper in half before she read it, even though we had plenty of table space. I never once asked her why. I wish I had. When she died, the house got very quiet in ways I hadn't anticipated. Not just sound quiet, empty quiet. The kind that sits on the furniture. My son Douglas lives 40 minutes away in Maryville. Good kid, works in hospital administration. He married Patrice 6 years ago, and for the first 2 years I thought she was wonderful. She brought dishes to the house when Carol was sick. She sat with Carol during chemo appointments when Douglas had to work. I told Douglas he'd found himself a good woman. I was wrong. Or maybe I was right about who she was then, and something changed. I've thought about it enough that I'm not sure anymore. It started small, the way these things always do. About 8 months after Carol passed, Douglas called me. He and Patrice were thinking about buying a house, a step up from their apartment in Maryville, something with a yard. They'd found a place they loved, but were about $11,000 short for the down payment. Could I help? I said yes without much thought. Carol and I had been careful with money our whole lives. Teacher's pension, modest savings, the house paid off. $11,000 wasn't nothing, but Douglas was my son, and it felt right to help. I wrote the check. Douglas called it a loan, said he'd pay it back within 2 years. 2 years passed. Nothing came back. I didn't push. He was building a life. Then 18 months after the house, Patrice called me herself. This was unusual. We talked occasionally, holidays and birthdays, but she didn't usually call just to call. She had a business idea, she said, a home staging company. She'd been doing it informally for a realtor friend, had real talent for it, thought she could build something. She needed $8,000 to cover licensing, a website, some basic equipment. Douglas was nervous about the risk, she said, so she was coming to me directly, as a woman who'd admired Carol's sensibility and taste, and knew I'd understand her vision. I gave her the $8,000. I wrote the check to her personally, not to them as a couple. Looking back, I see why she structured it that way. The staging company never quite launched. There were always reasons, supply chain issues, a bad review from one client, the market shifting. I stopped asking after a while. The pattern continued, but quietly enough that I didn't see it as a pattern, a request here, a favor there. Never enough to feel like a crisis. $300 when their furnace broke. $1,200 to cover a car repair when Douglas said he was between paychecks. I kept a ledger in my desk drawer, a habit from 30 years of grading on a budget. By the time things fell apart, the number was just over $22,000. The moment things actually changed was a Tuesday in October. I had my brother Vernon visiting from Chattanooga. Vernon is 68, retired, a man who takes up space in a room in a way I never quite managed. He'd driven up for a long weekend, and we were planning to drive out to Cades Cove on Wednesday morning, walk the loop, maybe have lunch in Townsend. I was looking forward to it the way older men look forward to things now, quietly, without saying too much about it. Douglas and Patrice showed up at my house unannounced around 7 on Tuesday evening. I saw the car pull in from the kitchen window. I told Vernon they were here, and he said he'd stay out of the way, settled himself in the living room with his book. They came in without knocking. Patrice walked ahead of Douglas the way she'd started doing in the last year or so, like she was leading something. Douglas looked at the floor when they entered, which told me enough. They sat at the kitchen table. I offered coffee. Patrice said they weren't staying long. The ask this time was $15,000. Douglas's hospital was restructuring, and there was a possibility of a layoff in his department. They wanted a cushion. They had a financial advisor, Patrice said, who told them the smart move was liquidity. They needed to get ahead of it before anything happened. She had her phone out with a spreadsheet showing their monthly expenses. I looked at the spreadsheet. It was very thorough and had a line item for streaming services. I told them no. There was a silence in the kitchen that I hadn't expected. I'd expected pushback, maybe some negotiating, some appeal to family loyalty. What I hadn't expected was how fast Patrice's expression changed, like a light switch. After everything we'd done for this family, she said, after I sat with Carol, after I gave up months of my life. I said Carol would have been grateful for that, and I was too. But it didn't change my answer. She stood up. Douglas was still looking at the table. "You're going to regret sitting on money while your son suffers," she said. "You're going to be old and alone, and you'll wish you'd been different." I told her I was already old, and I learned to live with myself. She walked out the kitchen door into the garage. I don't know what she was looking for out there. Maybe she wanted a moment away. Maybe she wanted to make an exit that didn't feel like an exit. When she came back through and I was still sitting at the table calmly, I think that made it worse. What happened next was fast. She shoved me, both hands flat against my chest. I was standing up by then, and I stumbled back against the counter. My elbow hit the edge of the sink, and I felt it immediately, a sharp, deep pain that I knew was going to be bad in the morning. She said something while she was doing it, but I was focused on not falling. Douglas finally looked up. "Patrice, what are you?" "Stay out of her family's business," she said to me, like I was a neighbor who'd wandered in. Then she left. Douglas stayed for about 90 seconds after that. Long enough to say he was sorry. Not long enough to mean it the way it needed to be meant. Then he left too. Vernon appeared in the kitchen doorway about 30 seconds after their car pulled out. He'd heard the whole thing. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said, "Ray." My name is Raymond, but Vernon has called me Ray my whole life. "Yeah," I said. "Your elbow's bleeding." It was. The corner of the sink had caught me just right. Vernon drove me to urgent care. Contusion, no fracture, wrapped and iced. The nurse asked how it happened, and I told her I'd stumbled against the counter. Not a lie, exactly, but not complete either. On the way home, I sat in the passenger seat, thinking about how I'd been doing that my whole life, softening the sharp edges of things, smoothing over the rough parts of stories to protect people who'd stopped deserving the protection. I couldn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table where the three of us had been sitting a few hours earlier, and I looked at the ledger in my desk drawer. $22,400. I'd written the numbers in pencil, which I now understood was a kind of wishful thinking, as if I expected them to change. At midnight, I called my college friend Hugh Mercer. Hugh has been a family law attorney in Knoxville for 30 years. We'd stayed close through the years, the way men stay close who shared a dorm room for 2 years and still trust each other completely. He answered on the third ring because Hugh is the kind of person who answers the phone, always has been. "It's late," he said. "I know. My daughter-in-law shoved me into the sink tonight. I have the urgent care paperwork." A pause. "Are you hurt?" "My elbow. Not serious. But Hugh, I need to know what I can do." "Tomorrow morning. My office. 8 o'clock. Hugh's office smelled like old books and decent coffee. He listened to everything without interrupting. When I finished, he pulled out a legal pad. "You have documentation of the loans?" I had the ledger, I had the bank statements, I had 3 text messages from Patrice referencing specific amounts. I had the urgent care paperwork from the previous night. Hugh wrote for a while. Then he said, "You can file a civil claim for the loans. Proving the terms is harder without a signed promissory note, but the text messages help establish acknowledgement. For the physical incident, you can file a police report and pursue assault charges. Given the medical documentation and the fact that it happened in your home, you have a legitimate case." He looked up. "What do you want the outcome to be?" I thought about Carol, about the spreadsheet with the streaming services line item, about Douglas looking at the table. "I want there to be a record," I said, "and I want my son to understand what he's allowed to happen." Hugh said both of those things were achievable. What I didn't tell Hugh that morning was the other part. The part I'd thought about sitting at the kitchen table at midnight, because the assault was clear and the civil claim was real, but there was something else I was starting to suspect, something I wanted to verify before I said it to anyone. My wife had a sister, Elaine, who lives in Nashville. They were close their whole lives, closer after our kids were born. Elaine had visited twice in the 2 years since Carol died, and we talked on the phone regularly. She was the person who still knew how to talk about Carol without either of us going silent. I called her from the car outside Hugh's office. "Elaine," I said, "I need to ask you something and I need you to answer me straight." "Okay," she said carefully. "In the last 2 years, has Patrice contacted you about anything financial? Any story about me or Douglas or their situation that led to any kind of ask?" The pause was long enough to tell me everything before she spoke. "Ray," she said, and then quietly she told me Douglas had been diagnosed with something, a kidney problem, that he was too proud to tell you, that they needed help with the treatment costs. I gave her $4,000. I sat in the car for a long time. Douglas doesn't have a kidney problem. He never has. I know this because I'd taken him to his last physical myself 6 months prior, because Patrice had been too busy and he'd needed someone to drive after the procedure. When I got home, I called Douglas's Aunt Miriam, who is Carol's other sister in Louisville. She confirmed it differently. Patrice had told her that I was struggling with memory issues, early onset, that the family was worried and that they were helping cover some of my expenses while I adjusted. She'd given him $5,000, feeling guilty about the distance. My wife's sisters had given Patrice $9,000 combined, based on lies, based on my dead wife's name. I sat very still with that information for about 2 hours. Then I drove to the hardware store and I bought a small indoor security camera. I put it in the living room, angled toward the front door and the hallway. I put a second one in the kitchen, in the corner near the window. I did this calmly and carefully, the way I'd approached 30 years of lesson plans. I called Hugh back in the afternoon. "There's more," I said, and I told him about Elaine and Miriam. Hugh was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That potentially moves us into fraud territory, eliciting money through false pretenses." Another pause. "This changes the scope considerably." "I know. I want you to come back in tomorrow, bring everything." I said I would, and then Hugh said, "Raymond, I need you to do something important. Don't tell Douglas what you know. Not yet. Not until we have the full picture filed and ready." I said I understood. I did understand. That didn't make it any easier to sit across from the fact of it. Douglas came by 3 days later, alone. Patrice wasn't with him, which told me she'd sent him on a mission she preferred not to witness. He sat at the kitchen table and he apologized for what had happened. He said Patrice had been under a lot of stress. He said she felt terrible. He said he hoped I could find it in my heart to understand that good people sometimes do things out of desperation. I listened. I made coffee. I set a mug in front of him. I told him I was glad he'd come. What I did not tell him was that I'd spent the previous 2 days meeting with Hugh, that we'd filed a police report for the assault, and that Hugh had made contact with a financial crimes investigator at the Knox County Sheriff's Office regarding the Elder Financial Exploitation Statute. Tennessee has specific law on this. Carol had been in my name, the loans had been from my account, and Elaine and Miriam were over 65. The law has something to say about that. I also did not tell him that Elaine was coming to Knoxville the following week and had agreed to give a statement. Douglas drank his coffee and said that maybe in time Patrice could come back and apologize herself. I said that would be fine. He left feeling like he'd patched something. 3 days after that, I drove to their house. It was a Tuesday morning around 10. I knew Patrice would be home because she'd posted something on Facebook about a working from home day. I sat in the driveway for a minute looking at the house that my $11,000 had helped purchase. The hydrangeas along the front walk were Carol's suggestion. I'd forgotten that until right then. I walked up the front steps and knocked. Patrice answered in a sweatshirt, coffee mug in hand. Her expression shifted through several things in the second she saw me. She landed on something carefully neutral. "Ray," she said. I held out the envelope. Standard manila, thick enough to look like it held something substantial. She looked at it. She looked at me. Something relaxed in her posture, like a conclusion had been reached. "Come on in," she said. I shook my head. "You don't need to. It's all in there." She took it. I turned and walked back to my car. I heard the envelope tear open before I reached the bottom porch step. In the car, I watched in my rearview mirror. She stood on the porch reading. She flipped to the second page, then the third. I couldn't see her face well from where I was parked, but I watched her sit down on the porch step, right down on the concrete, like her legs had simply decided to stop doing their job. The envelope contained a copy of the police report for the assault, a summary of the civil claim for $22,400 in documented loans, a letter from Hugh's office informing her that statements had been collected from Elaine and Miriam regarding the fraudulent solicitation of funds using false medical claims, and that this material had been forwarded to the Knox County Sheriff's Financial Crimes Unit. And on the last page, a copy of Tennessee Code Annotated 71-6117, the state statute on financial exploitation of elderly adults. I drove home. My hands were steady. The call started that afternoon. Patrice called 4 times. I didn't answer. She texted twice. I forwarded both to Hugh. The second one said, "This is insane. I never meant for any of this. We need to talk before this goes further." Hugh replied on my behalf with a single line advising her to contact her attorney. Douglas called at 6 that evening. His voice was different from the apologetic version 3 days prior, thinner, scared. "Dad, what did you do? What is this?" I said, "I protected myself, Douglas, the way I should have done a long time ago." "She's crying. She hasn't stopped. You can't just, this is our life. You borrowed $22,000 from me without any intention of returning it. Your wife physically assaulted me in my home, and she defrauded your mother's sisters, using stories about my mental decline and your non-existent illness. Douglas, I love you. That's why I'm doing this." A long silence. She said. He stopped. Started again. "The story about Aunt Elaine, I didn't know about that." That landed the way I expected it to land. The silence that followed was a different kind than before. "I didn't know about Aunt Miriam either," he said, very quietly. "I know," I said. "I believe you." Patrice had been doing it without him. That was the part I'd suspected but hadn't wanted to be right about, because it meant my son had been partly victim too, which was a harder grief than anger. Douglas came to the house the next morning. He didn't say much for a long time. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table, and I made coffee, same as before, and we sat across from each other with the truth of it filling the room. "I should have paid you back," he said, "the original loan. I told myself we would." "I know. I didn't know what she was doing with Elaine, or Miriam, or the staging company money." He looked up. "How much did she take, total?" "That I know of? Over 30,000 between my account and your aunt's." He put his face in his hands. "I want to be careful here about what happened next, because it wasn't simple and it wasn't clean. It would make a better story if it were. But what actually happened over the following weeks was slow and painful and had very few moments of satisfaction, the way people imagine satisfaction looks when justice arrives." Patrice retained an attorney. The criminal matter moved through the sheriff's office slowly. The civil case moved faster because Hugh was efficient and because the documentation was clear. Elaine flew down and gave her statement. Miriam drove up from Louisville. Watching those 2 women, my wife's sisters, sit in Hugh's conference room and describe how they'd been manipulated using Carol's memory and Douglas's invented illness, I had to hold very still to keep my face composed. Patrice and her attorney made 2 different settlement offers in the civil case. The first was insulting. The second, we accepted, $14,000, paid over 18 months. Not everything I was owed, but Hugh explained the realistic range, and I trusted him. The criminal matter resulted in a deferred prosecution agreement for the assault. Patrice agreed to complete an anger management program and have no contact with me for 2 years. The fraud investigation was ongoing, which was a phrase that felt unsatisfying but was real. Douglas and Patrice separated in November. He told me on the phone, flat-voiced, like he was reporting weather. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said I was sorry it had come to that. "Are you?" he said, not accusatory, genuinely asking. I'm sorry you're in pain, I said. I'm not sorry about what I did. She said you targeted her, that you'd wanted her gone since the beginning. What do you think? He was quiet. I think she lied to my aunts. I think she put her hands on my father. I think I should have been paying more attention. That was honest. I respected it. He came for Thanksgiving. Just the two of us, a simple thing, turkey breast and the sweet potato casserole Carol used to make from a recipe her mother had written on a note card that I keep in the spice drawer. Douglas found the note card when he was looking for the cinnamon. He held it for a minute before he handed it to me. Carol's handwriting, the ink faded to a lighter blue than it used to be. We didn't talk about Patrice much that day. We talked about other things, his work, Vernon's plan to drive out to see us in the spring, an old story about Carol that Douglas had never heard, something funny from before he was born. He laughed when I told it, the way laughing and missing someone occupy the same space sometimes. Before he left, he stood in the doorway and said, "I'm going to pay you back the rest, what the settlement didn't cover." I said he didn't have to do that. He said he knew he didn't have to. Elaine called me the week after Thanksgiving. She'd received the first payment from her portion of the civil settlement. She said she was putting it in a savings account she'd named after Carol in her head, not formally, just in her thinking. She was going to use it someday for something Carol would have liked. A trip, maybe. Something beautiful and a little impractical. I told her that sounded exactly right. Vernon called on a Sunday in December. He wanted to know if we were still doing Cades Cove in the spring, the trip we'd never managed to take the previous October. I said yes. I said I'd book the cabin. He said, "You doing okay, Ray? Really okay?" I thought about it. The house still got quiet in the ways I hadn't anticipated. Carol's handwriting still lived in the spice drawer. Douglas was rebuilding something, slowly, the way things actually rebuild, without a clean before and after. "Getting there," I said. That was the truth. Not the whole truth, maybe, but the part of it I could hold without breaking. Sometimes that's what 64 looks like. Not restored, not finished, just still standing, still putting one foot in front of the other, still making coffee for two by habit, even when there's only one cup needed. The spring trip to Cades Cove is already on the calendar. I'm not waiting anymore to do the things worth doing. I keep coming back to the ledger. Not the one in my desk drawer with the numbers written in pencil. I mean the other kind. The one you carry inside yourself without realizing it. Every time I let something slide, every time I smoothed over the sharp edges of a story to protect someone who'd stopped deserving the protection, I made a small entry. I told myself it was kindness. It was something else. It was the habit of a man who'd spent 30 years teaching young people how to think clearly, then went home and refused to think clearly about his own life. What Patrice built didn't happen overnight. It happened in increments, the way most damage does. A small ask, a reasonable-sounding explanation, a story calibrated just right to reach through grief and pull out compliance. She understood something about people who've recently lost someone they loved. We want to keep being useful. We want the loss to mean something. She used that. She used Carol's name, Carol's memory, the love I had for my wife, and turned it into a tool. That's not misfortune. That's a choice a person makes, and choices have weight. But I have to be honest about my own entries in that ledger, too. I didn't ask Elaine if she was okay. I didn't check with Miriam. I assumed that because I hadn't heard trouble, there was none. That's not wisdom. That's the comfortable version of paying attention, the kind that costs nothing and protects nothing. When I finally called Elaine and heard the pause before she spoke, I understood that my silence had been its own kind of harm. Not malicious, not intentional, but real. What changed things wasn't anger. Anger visited, stayed a night or two, then left. What changed things was sitting at that kitchen table at midnight with a ledger written in pencil and deciding that the people I loved, Carol's sisters, my son who didn't know what his wife was doing, deserved someone who would hold the line clearly and without apology. That took something different than anger. It took the willingness to be uncomfortable for a long time, to make a phone call at midnight, to walk up a porch with an envelope and not flinch. Douglas is rebuilding something now. I watch him choose honestly over easily, and it costs him, and he does it anyway. That's the part that gives me the most peace, not the settlement, not the deferred prosecution, not any of the legal machinery that ground slowly forward. It's my son standing in a doorway saying he's going to pay back what wasn't even his debt to carry. That's a man deciding what kind of person he's going to be. You can't hand someone that. They have to reach for it themselves. I'm 64 years old. I have a spring trip on the calendar and a recipe card in my spice drawer written in faded blue ink. The house still gets quiet in the ways I didn't expect, but I know now that quiet and defeated are not the same thing. Sometimes the bravest version of a life is just a man who did the hard thing when it needed doing, then went home and made coffee and kept going. The trip to Cades Cove is already booked. I'm not waiting anymore.